Thank you so much, and of course, many thanks to all of you guys for joining. You know, I'm already so happy to be here. It's my very first time at this conference, and it's my very first time here in Oslo. I think that's not a big surprise. But even though I'm so happy to be here, I'm definitely more happy that you are here. Now, just about a year ago, I was invited to give a talk at the Star East conference in Orlando. And they gave me a room for 500 people, a huge room. And you know what? Just 5 people showed up. So you can imagine how happy I am to have you in that session. So thanks so much for coming again. Now, just on my way from Vienna to Oslo, I finished this book. It's called Start With Why from Simon Sinek. It's a fabulous book. I highly recommend to read it. And then I thought, well, it would also make sense to give you the reason why I'm going to talk about exploratory testing in the next 30 minutes or so. And so here it is. So that's my personal why. So to me, it appears more and more that exploratory testing is truly like a deodorant. And the reason for this is simple, because the people who really need it never use it. So that is why I'm here today, guys, because I want to change that. To do that, let me say at least some words about my person first to put a little bit more drama into the story. So I'm Ingo. I'm working for UiPath. UiPath is a software company deep in the field of robotic process automation, RPA. And I joined UiPath beginning of May this year. And when I joined UiPath, I quickly realized that all the people at UiPath, they do not just think automation, they also feel automation all day long. So from that perspective, automation can be understood somehow as the Bible for the people at UiPath. And the reason for this, again, is simple, because our vision at UiPath is to enable everyone out there to automate their repetitive, dreary, and uninteresting tasks in their daily business. So that's why we are, and that's what we do. So that means automation sits at the epicenter of our company. Now, even though I'm working for such an automation-focused company, I like to see all the tools we provide, and I like to see all the tools we have in software testing as classes. And just as classes do not see, the tools do not test, right? I would rather say that the classes help us to see and the tools help us to test. So the bottom line here is that the classes don't do the seeing. The seeing is something that happens here. And the same holds true for testing. So I like to say that tools don't do the testing happens here. So testing is something that happens in your heads. It's not something that happens in your tools. And as a result of this, I also like to not reduce testing to an act of artifact management, where you create test cases, you automate those test cases, you execute those test cases, and you maintain those test cases. Testing to me is so much more than that. And so I can safely say that testing is no more about test cases and so test tools than astronomy is about telescopes. And this means if we would reduce testing to an act of test case creation, and especially automation, I think we also would need to accept the fact that when we are testing badly, automation would just help us to test badly at an accelerated rate. So what it means is we need to avoid that we automate chaos, right? Because if you automate chaos, all you get is faster chaos. And here is how it usually looks like. So this is a typical software testing timeline, based on the few data points I've collected over the past years. Now, in this software testing timeline, as you can see, is composed of 4 phases. Now, in the first phase, I hear people saying, testing? What is that? Never heard of that, right? There is only automation. We automate everything. And it usually takes quite some time until those people then fall down what I like to call the Mount Stupid of software testing. And it's a huge mountain. But when those people then fall down that Mount Stupid, they immerse into what I like to call the Valley of Despair. And in that Valley of Despair, I hear those people saying, okay, there is testing, and testing is probably more than just automation, but we're just not convinced that we really need it. And you know what? The last 2 phases then often look like this. And now let's zoom into those last 2 phases to see what's really going on there. And now I need your imagination, guys. Imagine that all these dots on that slide represent all the test cases you have, for example, in your regression test case portfolio. And now imagine that all these test cases pass in the last regression test run before you decide to ship your product into production. And then you might say, well, that looks good, right? So let's ship it. Let's ship our software product and let's be happy. But just a second later, you will see something like this. And this is usually the point in time where people start realizing that repetitive test case execution, no matter whether it is done by machines or by humans, is by far not enough to avoid scenarios like this. And this is usually the point in time where people start to rediscover the beauty and the power of a concept which is now known as exploratory testing. That's the reason why I've chosen that title, by the way. So now let's see how we avoid scenarios like this. And let me start with this picture here. So after having been in the business of software development for more than 15 years already, this is exactly how I see the discipline. This is how I see software development. To me, software development is a lot like wrestling in the mud with a pig. And the pig is the software here. And the mud is all the complexity, the uncertainty we are confronted with when we develop our software, right? This is at least how I see it. Now, when this is software development, the question then is, well, what the heck is then software testing? Well, then I would say software testing is all about washing that pig. And it's not just about washing a pig, it's all about washing a performing pig. Because as the pig is constantly in motion, on your farm, for example, our software is constantly under change. So from that naive perspective, one can safely say that testing is all about washing a performing pig. And as we all know, that can be messy, right? Because that usually has no rules, no clear beginning, no clear middle, and no clear end. And sometimes, honestly, it's kind of a pain in the ass. Because when you're done washing your pig, testing your software, you're not sure if the pig is really clean or why you were washing your pig in the first place. So now let's see how we wash that pig. Let's see how we test software. And now I need your imagination again. Imagine that this rectangle here represents the entire functional and non-functional spectrum of your software product. And it represents all the environments your software could be situated in. And it represents all the people that might use your software. So that's all there is, and that's all you could possibly know about your software. Try to imagine that. Now the green rectangle then represents all what you currently know about your software. And this rectangle is apparently smaller than the previous one, because I'm at least convinced that you will never be able to always know everything down to the very last detail about your software product, period. The red rectangle is what you repeatedly check in your software, for example, through repetitive test case execution. And again, this rectangle is smaller than the previous one because I'm convinced that you will never be able to check everything you know at any time. Now here the question is, well, would it even make sense to go for that? Would it even make sense to strive to codify, to automate everything you know at any time? Well, most of the people say, yeah, that's the ultimate goal, right? We need to automate testing. But I'm saying no, because if you solely aim to codify everything you know at any time, the question comes up is, how do you create new knowledge about your software? And you have to create new knowledge about your software because your software constantly grows. You add more and more features to your software. You change your software. And so you constantly need to expand the knowledge about your software. Why? To be able to identify all the problems that are far, far outside your checking regime. And this somehow explains how I see testing. So me, testing is all about closing this knowledge gap. It's all about closing the gap between what we know and what we don't know about our software. So to me, testing is all about gathering quality-related information about our software. It's not about doing automation. And Jerry Weinberg once explained it to me like this. He said, think of what a test actually is. And he said, a test is a question you ask your software. And the point of running the test, of asking that question, is to gain information. And that's the reason why, to me, testing is, always has been, and hopefully always will be, a search for information. But don't get me wrong, the information sought often requires automation, but it does not require automation every single time. So that, again, I see our service as an information service, not as an automation service. So what we do is we gather quality-related information about our software. The risks, for example, the problems that might happen in our software. And we collect that information to enable other people, like product owners, product managers, your developers, to make better decisions. That's it. And those decisions are fixing decisions or shipping decisions. So that is why I see testing as an information service. And that is how I think we can elevate our testing roles in an organization quite easily, by helping other people to make better decisions by the information we provide through our profession, which we call testing. Now, and I think this picture already suggests how I see testing. So I think there are two sides of the testing coin, in case you want to think black and white about testing, which is never a good thing to do, but it helps to simplify things. So I see something is thoroughly tested when it has been checked by efficient, formal, repetitive test case execution, of course based on a solid test case design, and when it has been explored by the richness of intellect of human beings, by you guys. So the two sides of the testing coin is all about monitoring the known risks through checking. So here we confirm what we already know about our software, and exploring, where we are trying to analyze potential risks. Here we're trying to find out new information about our software. And now let's dive a little bit deeper into both of them to see what's really going on there. Checking. Michael Bolton once put it that way. He said, checking is all about evaluating a product by applying algorithmic decision rules to specific observations of a product. Now, usually nobody gets what that really means, right? Now, in short, it means here you operate your product in a mechanistic way. And you do that in order to answer a very simple question. And that question is, does this assertion pass or fail? Now, the thing here is that the answer to this question is always a binary answer. It's either yes or no. It's on or off. It's 0 and 1. And this means that this question is machine decidable. And this means it's algorithmic. And you know what that means? The process of answering this question can be automated. And you know what? It should be automated, because I don't want to do what a machine can do in testing. So I want to learn about my product by applying exploration, experimentation, and investigation to my software product. And I'm doing this primarily to answer a much, much bigger question. And that question is there a problem here? And as we all know, this question usually does not have a binary answer. So this means this question is just damn harder to automate than this one here. Let me conclude this brief section in the name of Rich Rogers, a brilliant guy from down under. He said, when we are doing checking, we're evaluating our software for following specific instructions that might be contained in your test cases. And here you pay attention only to the deviations from the expected results in your test cases. So he says, well, it's basically all about creating test cases. And he sees a test case just as a step-by-step description. So you follow those steps, you follow those specific procedures to, for example, examine specific conditions in your requirements, the acceptance criteria in your user stories, for example. But the point here is, when you reduce testing to an act of checking, you make testing become a factory process, where you put your requirements in and you get test cases out. But to me, testing is more than that. And in contrast to that, exploratory testing is all about investigating your product through performing powerful experiments. And those experiments might be driven, for example, by all your testing heuristics. And here you don't just pay attention to the deviations of the expected results in your test cases. Here you pay attention to anything that might help you to identify whether there's a problem in your software or not. And this might be a reference system, this might be a design document, a specification, an architecture document, or this might just be something you discussed with your developer friend last night when you were out of a beer with him, for example. So it's all about using test oracles in the most broadest sense. So here it is all about creating test ideas rather than it is about creating test cases. And here you follow your clues to examine the risks. the problems that might happen in your software. And I think this is what makes testing become an adaptive investigation rather than a factory process. So from that perspective, you could say everything you see on the left-hand side is a very mechanical approach to testing. Everything you see on the right-hand side is more like a creative process to testing. And creativity is simply defined as the ability to break out of your established thinking patterns. And the reason why we want to break out of our established thinking patterns is we want to find new problems in our software. And my main message now to all the test managers in the room is fairly simple. Guys, please do not reduce testing just to an act of checking, because then you reduce your testers to checkers. You make them become robots, at least to some extent. So also focus on the creative part. Now with all that, guys, I don't want you to get me wrong on this. I'm not saying that checking, that's the bad thing, right? And exploration, that's the good thing, right? I'm just saying that it's not about the one and not just about the other. It's about both at the same time. And when you do testing, there's a constant interplay between checking and exploring, always with the connotation of investigation and experimentation, of course. And so I always remind myself about this when I'm creating a test case. I remind myself that behind every test case I create, there is a test I perform. And behind every test I perform, there is a test idea I've had. And behind every test idea I've had, there is me. There's a human tester. Now this tells me two things. It tells me that when my test cases suck, it's probably me who sucks. Number two, my test success does not necessarily depend on the number of test cases I create and automate. It depends on the quality of your test idea. And the guy who once said that is right up here, Pradeep. And I'm just in love with this statement. So that means there's a hell of a lot of things going on before you're even able to create a test case. And sometimes we forget about this because we are just lulling ourselves into those test automation endeavors. And here are just a few of those activities that I perform when I'm doing testing. Here is my simple substitution of testing. So when I'm testing, I'm applying learning, exploration, experimentation, modeling, studying, drawing inferences, questioning facts, making decisions, designing test labs, preparing test labs. I apply a hell of a lot emotional thinking, logical thinking, and a hell of a lot critical thinking. So there's a bunch of activities that need to be done in order to be able to perform a check and then to translate this check into a test case. That's all I want to say. That's my holistic view of testing. And this also tells me one thing. It tells me one thing, and that is that automated checking, some call it test case automation, some call it test automation, is just a minuscule dot on a minuscule dot on a minuscule dot in the space of testing. So to me, exploration, investigation, experimentation, all those human capabilities, they're not special to testing, they're essential to testing. And for that reason, I regard all testing as exploratory. So to me, the term exploratory testing, to some extent, is redundant because it suggests that the term exploratory gives the term testing a meaning, but it's completely nonsense. The term exploratory or exploratory just means for the purpose of discovery. That's all what it means. And we always want to discover problems in our software. Now, having that said, let's focus more now on the exploratory testing side of it. I still keep that notion now. Now the good news here is that exploratory testing is not a talent. So you don't need to be a super smart person or a bright mind to do that, right? An Einstein-like mind. No, it's a set of skills. And the cool thing about this, you can learn those skills. So let me show you how we translate in all of our projects the approach of exploratory testing into reality. Let me show you some techniques we apply to do that. And I would just want to focus on our main 5 components. The first one is kind of an obvious technique. It's called session-based testing, which is around since the year 2000, introduced by John Buck, the brother of James Buck. And what session-based testing does to exploratory testing can be described like this. It takes exploratory testing and it puts it into a straitjacket. So it puts all the imagination that comes along with all the human testers in that testing session into a straitjacket. And by imagination, I just mean the ability to form new test ideas. Now, of course, it depends on how tight you tie up that straitjacket. And by tighten up the straitjacket, I just mean we constrain the scope and we constrain the goals of a testing session. Okay? We just provide constraints. And the reason why we provide those constraints is to make exploratory testing structured. And guess what? Why the reason is we want to make it structured? Because to allow it for larger scale implementations. And guess why we want to do that? Because that we can roll out exploratory testing also to large agile enterprises. Because it's fairly easy to do exploratory testing consistently for 1, 2, or 3 agile teams, but it's a damn hard thing to do it consistently for 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, or even more agile teams in a truly large enterprise. And the reason why we want to do it, at least to some extent consistently, is to measure its effectiveness and as well as the efficiency of our exploratory testing sessions. So that's the reason why we go for this concept to make exploratory testing structured. Now, the core object of session-based testing is a session. And according to John Buck, that's just a chartered, reviewable, and uninterrupted unit of testing effort. Now, that is what a session is. And that unit of testing effort usually is time-boxed. Let's say to 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours. It always depends on the context. And the reason why we time-box a session is not just for the sake of time-boxing a session, it is to curb our perfectionist tendencies during testing, to avoid that we dig into the same hole deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Because it usually happens when there is no deadline. And I think we all experience that. There's a simple reason why we optionally give our testers the chance to allocate a fixed time frame to their testing sessions. And the core object of a session is the session charter. And the session charter is just a mission statement for all the people that are part of the testing session. It might be you and your colleague, it might be your developer friend, it might be a product owner, it might be any user role. And in the charter, we usually describe 2 things. We describe the scope and the goals of our testing session in a very precise and concise way. It shouldn't take you longer, more than 5 minutes to write that charter. That's the key point here. So how do we define the scope of our testing session? Well, here we use a very traditional requirements-based testing approach. And I know that you guys will say, well, man, how can you even say requirements in the agile era, right? Now we say user stories, epics, and themes. Well, the way we see a requirement is we see it as a service. As a service we provide through our software to our end users so that these end users can achieve their goals, whatever these goals are. And you might express those requirements, those services as user stories, as epics, as themes, as stakeholder needs, as system use cases, business use cases, or features. Take whatever you like. At the end of the day, those artifacts will just describe the services you provide to your end users so that these guys can achieve their goals. And we take those requirements as a basis to define our straitjacket, to limit the scope of our testing session. And when we then do that, when we explore that scope, for example, those requirements and everything that surrounds those requirements, we don't just compare the actual product to its product specification, we also compare the actual product to its product idea. Now, in ISDQB terms, this means we don't just verify our product in terms of does our software meet the specification, we also validate our software. So we also ask ourselves, does our software meet the end user's needs? And this says a lot how we see our software. We see our software just as a solution for someone's problem. That's it. We build our software just for the sake of solving someone's problem out there. We don't just build it for the sake of building a cool, nice software product, right? And that's the reason why we pay so much attention to our stakeholders when we do testing. Now, when we explore our software, when we make those comparisons, we also apply a lot of BDD. And now you might say, well, BDD and exploratory testing doesn't really come together, right? But as Liz once pointed out, BDD to us is just the art of using examples in conversations to illustrate behavior. And the keyword is here conversations. And Markus, I think, touched on it already in his keynote. He said here it's all about communication and conversation. So BDD for us is a technique, it's kind of a tool we use in order to create a shared understanding between all the team members. And this says that having those conversations, for example, in sprint planning meetings, in backlog grooming meetings, or every day when we do a whiteboard session, so having those conversations is much more important than capturing conversations to us, and capturing those conversations is much more important to us than automating those conversations, automating those given when-then scenarios, for example. So to us, it's a tool to create a shared understanding. It's not primarily a tool to do test case automation. And here's the simple reason why. Now I need your imagination again. Imagine that this circle represents all what your product owner thinks about your software, okay? Then this circle usually represents what your product owner can put into words. Then this is what the product owner usually tells you, the course of your sprint planning meeting, for example. And this is what you usually understand. It's not just because we are all so stupid, it's just because of the fact there's a huge knowledge gap between what your product owners think and what you understand. This holds true for every user role. And BDD is just a nice way to close this knowledge gap again. That's the reason why we go for that. And when we do that, we are guided by questions. And those questions are driven by our testing heuristics. And we have a bunch of testing heuristics in our team. This is just one example. It's called RC. This one is especially helpful when you are confronted with an ever-changing system. There's another one out there like SFDPOD, stands for San Francisco Depot. This is so-called mnemonic of the heuristic. This one is helpful when you are confronted with a completely new product in a completely new business domain, for example. And the way we see those heuristics are just a set of questions. A set of guiding questions that help us to drive those conversations. The reason why we want to drive and guide those conversations is to learn about our software, to close that knowledge gap, to do testing. That's a simple reason why we go for it. Now, this is how we structure exploratory testing through session-based testing, and this is how we limit the scope through that requirements-based testing approach, by applying many different techniques. How do we set goals of our testing session? Who of you has ever heard about an approach which is called tour-based testing? Just a couple of guys. So let me say some words about that. Now, this concept is also out there for more than 15 years already, at least. And there are many different schools of tour-based testing out there. And in those schools of tour-based testing, there are many different testing tours. Now, the one I really like most is the one described by James Whittaker in his book, Exploratory Software Testing. It was, by the way, the very first book who had the name Exploratory Testing in its title. It was published in 2009. And in this book, he described a couple of tours. And these tours were, for example, called the supermodel tour, the museum tour, the FedEx tour, the couch potato tour, the money tour, for example. And what these tours are doing for you is they allow you to set a concrete goal for your testing session by providing a crystal clear testing focus. So that means a testing tour is not just taking a test case and then calling it a tour, it's the entire metaphor. It's an exploration around a theme. Now, what does it mean? Let's take the FedEx tour as an example. Now, you all know FedEx, right? So FedEx is the label in the package delivery world. Now, what FedEx does, it just takes their packages and they move it around different destination centers on planet Earth. That is what FedEx basically does. Now, you do kind of the same when you apply the testing tour. What you do, for example, is you create a piece of data in your software. Like, for example, you create a customer in your banking application. And then you try to find all the features in your software that somehow purge, modify, or delete that piece of data. And by that, you just want to make sure if you have a consistent data flow through your application. That's it. It's a very, very narrow focus, but it's a crystal clear goal. Once you did that, within 10 minutes, 15 minutes, time boxed, you move on to another piece of data. You move on to the next tour. It's really optional. That's how we do it. And it's a fun approach to do it. Now, why do we do that? Well, we all touched on the term quality these days. And that is truly a quantity we try to increase, right? But it's all about quality at speed, so to say. But I think every one of you knows what speed means. But I just want to make it crystal clear to you what I mean by quality. Now, I looked it up in the dictionary, and what the dictionary says, it's quality is the degree of excellence of something. And I think that does it quite well, right? You say, well, this is excellent. You say it's of high quality, basically. The question here is, who measures this degree of excellence? And the point here is, it is measured by someone, by a human being. And I think this was one of those reasons why Jerry Weinberg said, quality is value to some person. And he then, after a couple of years, refined it together with Michael Bolton and James Buck and said, quality is value to some person who matter at some point in time. And this means that the person here represents your stakeholders, the people for whom you are building your product. And now this doesn't really help, right? Now I've replaced quality by the term value. So how do we create value? How do we attain value for our stakeholders? By solving their problems, by helping them to achieve their goals. The better we can do that, the higher the quality of our software. So that means, as Boris pointed it out, this stuff is not quantifiable. Why? Because quality, from that sense, is inherently subjective. So we can talk about quality, we can assess it, but we cannot measure it in terms of 0 and 1s. And this means that different stakeholders will perceive the same product as having different levels of quality. Now, why is that? What you might think is usable in the software might not be usable for me, for example, right? And this says a lot about what a bug is. And James Buck once said, a bug is something that bugs somebody. And even though that's a fun statement, there's also deep meaning behind it, because it also says that a bug is not necessarily within your software product. It's more about the relationship between the people who are using your software and your software. And to me, as a product management, that makes my life much easier, because it allows me to resolve a bug by just replacing the stakeholders. So this is just my secret to you guys. So what does it mean for us testers? So we must look for different things for different stakeholders, right? And this means we must diversify testing. How do we do that? Well, we apply an approach which we call Polychrome Testing. And Polychrome just means different colors. Doing an art of work in different colors. And that is what we try to do with testing. We try to colorize testing. How do we do that? Well, we do that in 2 ways. First of all, we invite as many as different user roles to our session. Not just testers, not just developers, also product owners, product managers, support engineers, business experts, subject matter experts, system administrators, people from the ops side, people from the business side, people from IT, people from development. So to diversify our sessions in that way. We do these grand sessions, what we call, at least twice a week, when we release every 2 weeks, just for a time scale. The second way we do is we apply an approach which is called as the 6 thinking heads. Who of you knows the concept of the 6 thinking heads? About 10 guys. So what is the concept about? First of all, this has nothing to do with software testing. It is a concept that is out there for more than 20 years already. And it's a concept that is being used to solve business issues in general. And the core components of that concept are the 6 thinking heads. They're literally heads. So, and each head, as you can see, has a certain color associated with it. And each color stands for a certain viewpoint, for a certain thinking direction. For example, here you have the black hat that stands for critical thinking. You are seeking for the negatives, for problems, for issues, for example. Then here you have the white hat. It stands for factual thinking. Here, for example, when you're under that hat in your testing session, you're trying to figure out if your software product really holds true for whatever is stated in your documentation, in your manual, in your marketing collateral, and so on and so forth. And another one is, that's my lovely one here, that's the red hat. It's all about emotional thinking. So here you should express what you like, what you dislike, what you hate, what makes you passionate when you do testing your software. And for all of those who are interested in how to apply that powerful concept, we can do an exercise afterwards. I don't have time to do it right now. Just meet me, we can do that. It's explained in 5 minutes based on a very simple example how to apply that concept. It's really, really cool. And it's fun again, okay? So we give those people in those sessions just the option to think under a certain hat. And then they can also switch hats, okay? And this diversifies our approach to testing. I'm done in a second. Last technique is just a fancy name of saying, well, we capture all the test ideas we had. And here, for example, different note-taking techniques or tools get into the game that support us in doing that. So we call it scenario-based testing. I know it's another bad name. But the reason why we want to capture those test ideas is to make our session reviewable. Because especially in the debriefing session, that means the thing that happens afterwards, after you had your testing session with your session owner, for example, you figure out, okay, what did you miss? Do you need more time? What are the next steps we need to do? Or what are the next sessions we need to plan? Now, this is in short how we roll exploratory testing in our projects. And when there's one thing we have learned by applying all this stuff, then I think it's this one. To us, testing is not so much a thing you do, guys. It's much more a way you think. So my takeaway for you is, please see testing as a thinking process. And if you want to change the way you test, you definitely need to change the way you think. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Hi, hello.
Hi.
So I have a question. You are mentioned about like session testing in sessions. So if you want to focus on one time-based session, do you approach with the different, let's say, all different hats in one session, or do you want to divide this to the different sessions? So do you want to apply all different approaches in one session, or do you like to divide this?
So I don't know what all the task means, but I think I get your idea.
Okay.
So you know, it depends on the scope I set for myself. So I'm doing that for myself. Even as a product manager, I make my testing sessions when I need to challenge my product to evaluate it. Like, aka that's testing. So when I see, okay, there is something which is now outside my scope, that's not a bad idea. I just take a note and I move on within the scope. And when I see something which, okay, there's maybe a task I should perform, something I should challenge, which is again outside my scope, then I'll take a note. And after the session, after those 15 minutes, 20 minutes, or the 1 hour, I say, well, okay, so these are all the things I found that might be interesting that were outside my scope. I create another session, okay? That's how I roll it. But I also see tests and say, okay, then let's just incrementally increase the scope of a session. That's also what you can do. So there's neither a right or wrong, I would say. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Any other questions? Please remember that you can post your questions in the app. Let me go around.
Hi. I have a very simple question. Because we're very busy in our projects, as always, how do you think, how much time should we spend on exploratory testing in our, I don't know, sprints or whatever?
Exactly 2.345 hours a day.
Maybe a follow-up question?
Does that help? No, the thing here is, you are doing it all the time. You're doing it all the time. That was the point I was trying to make. Think of all the activities you do when you test your software. When you are in your company, in that project, in a specific context, 8 hours a day, for example. Try to think about all the activities you do. And then think about, are these testing activities? And most of the times we will say, yes, of course they are. So these are all the activities that are part of what I say that's exploratory testing, because all those activities help you to find new problems, okay? It's not a special thing. This is a very structured approach, I've shown it before. You don't need to apply this. This is just what makes it structured. It also helps to onboard other team members more quickly in your projects, basically. So I can't give you an answer to this question. I'm so sorry about it, because I'm saying, don't stop doing it, because you always do it. Make sense? Okay.
Okay, one last quick question.
Hi. I'm personally a big fan of exploratory testing, and what you said just resonates with me a lot. But you said that testing quality is subjective, yeah. But still, our employers, our stakeholders want to see some value, yeah. Want it to be measured, yeah. So can you share some approaches actually how you measure the effects of exploratory testing, and when you sell it, for example, what should be the selling points and accents on that? Thanks.
So two different questions. How do I sell it? Well, when I'm in a project in a specific company, I'm trying to truly evangelize testing. So what I'm doing, I make workshops with probably all the people, at least in software development. I'll tell our software developers how we see testing, that we have a holistic view on that. That's the same with our product managers, product owners, for example, right? I write blogs, I make internal webinars, for example, among all those workshops. So that is how you create a culture around testing and to bring everyone on the same board, okay? What is the first part of your, how do you measure that stuff, right? How do you communicate it to others? I mean, I think Markus already gave an example how to do that, right? Always relate what you find to the risks, right? He gave the example with the security risks. So what is the impact of the problem you found to your business? What's the estimated impact? And I think that's all you need to do at the end of the day. You, at the end of the day, you don't have to make this decision. I'll just provide that information to someone else. And I need to provide that information in a way that this someone else, your test manager probably, or your product manager, can make a decision based on the data I provide. So when you're asking me how do I need to communicate the data, what do I need to measure, ask the people who are making decisions based on your data. I can't give you, again, a universal answer. And the way you can do that, guys, believe it or not, talk to these people. You can only figure that out when you talk to these people. Talk to your boss and say, how can I help you to make a better decision at the end of the day? What kind of data do you need? Not data, what kind of information do you need from myself, from my testing that supports your decision-making process? Hope that helps.
Ingo Philipp, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much.